"Just leave him out there. The storm's too dangerous," crackled a voice through the CB radio. But Jack Turner didn't listen. He pulled on his heavy coat, opened his truck door, and stepped straight into the blizzard. Fighting through the howling snow, he found the stranger nearly frozen and dragged him back into the safety of his cab. The next morning, Jack thought it was all over, until Navy Jeeps began lining up outside his small house, and a man in full uniform stepped onto his porch. Jack Turner lived a life most people never noticed. At 62 years old, he had the kind of presence that blended quietly into the background, not from weakness, but from the calm strength of a man who had spent his prime years doing things few would understand. Jack had once served as a logistics specialist in the United States Marine Corps. He wasn't a war hero whose name was etched in textbooks, nor a metal-clad officer marching in parades. He was the man who made sure supplies reached soldiers when bullets and sandstorms tried to stop them. 20 years of service, steady, unglamorous, and absolutely essential. When a transport accident in 2004 left him with a slight limp, Jack took it as a quiet signal that it was time to move on. He traded the endless convoys of military life for the rolling highways of civilian work, becoming a long-haul truck driver. Life after service was simple, and that was just how Jack liked it. He owned a small, weathered house in a sleepy town on the outskirts of New Hampshire. The kind of town where life moves slower, where people nodded in greeting but rarely asked questions. Most days, Jack could be found under the hood of his old truck, repairing a loose belt or replacing worn brake pads. If something in the house needed fixing, a leaking faucet, a broken step, a drafty window, Jack did it himself. He didn't ask for help. He didn't expect much from anyone. His neighbors knew him only as that quiet trucker veteran, always ready to lend a wrench or a hand, but never seeking anything in return. There were no holiday parties, no backyard barbecues in his yard. Jack's life followed a simple rhythm: work, home repairs, quiet evenings with a cup of black coffee and the occasional radio crackling news about faraway places he no longer belonged to. But that ordinary routine was about to be shattered. December arrived with a silent fury. The local news had been warning of a powerful storm all week. One for the record books, they called it. Most people stocked up on canned goods and firewood. Schools closed preemptively. The air grew heavy with that electric stillness that only comes before a blizzard, the kind of storm that doesn't just inconvenience life, but stops it dead in its tracks. Jack, stubborn and steady as ever, loaded up his truck anyway. He had a delivery scheduled for Maple Creek by morning, and a promise was a promise. Freight didn't move itself, and Jack Turner had never been the kind of man to let a little weather change his word. That night, as Jack rolled onto the empty highway, the first heavy flakes began to fall slow at first, like a curtain lowering on a stage, then faster, thicker, until the world outside his windshield turned into a swirling wall of white. A storm was coming, a storm unlike any he had faced in years, and somewhere down that frozen highway, destiny was already waiting for him. The snow hammered down with a fury Jack hadn't seen in years. Visibility shrank to barely the edge of his headlights, and even then the world beyond them looked like the inside of a snow globe shaken by angry hands. The highway ahead was no longer a road. It was a suggestion. Jack slowed to a crawl, every muscle tense, every instinct sharpened. His old CB radio crackled with static and voices of other truckers trapped by the storm. "Roads closed up ahead," one voice barked. "No point pushing through, find a place to hole up." Jack grunted in agreement, scanning for a safe spot to pull over. He wasn't a fool. Some battles you chose to sit out, just as he eased the rig toward a snowy shoulder. A different transmission cut through the noise, clipped urgent. "There's someone out there, standing by the side of the road, not moving." Another voice jumped in, rough and dismissive. "Leave 'em, nobody's worth freezing to death, over." Jack froze. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. Through the swirling white outside, he caught the faintest glimpse, a dark shape hunched over, barely upright, battered by the wind. Most would have ignored it. Most would have listened to fear to reason. Jack Turner wasn't most people. Without thinking twice, he threw the truck into park, grabbed his heavy winter coat from behind the seat, and shoved his arms through the sleeves with urgency. The cold slammed into him the moment he cracked the door open, a slap of pure, merciless wind. He tugged the collar of his coat higher, zipped it up to his chin, and stepped out. The snow swallowed him instantly. Every step was a battle. The wind howled in his ears, pushing him sideways, clawing at his jacket. His boots sank into the deep drifts, making each movement feel like dragging through wet concrete. The figure ahead barely moved. "Hey!" Jack shouted, though the storm ripped the word from his mouth. No response. He pushed harder, the muscles in his injured legs screaming until he finally reached the man. Up close, Jack could see it, the frost clinging to the man's eyebrows, the bluish tinge of his lips, a thin, inadequate jacket flapped against his frail frame. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed him around the shoulders. "Come on, buddy. You're not dying out here." The stranger sagged against him, too weak to protest. Gritting his teeth, Jack half carried, half dragged the man back toward the truck, step by brutal step. The cab's glow looked impossibly far away, a tiny beacon in the blinding white. By the time Jack wrestled the door open and hoisted the man inside, his own fingers had gone numb. He slammed the door shut, cranked the heater up to full blast, and wrapped the stranger in every spare blanket he could find. The man shivered violently, but he was alive. Jack poured hot coffee from his thermos, pressing the cup into frozen hands. "You're safe now," he muttered, voice rough with cold and concern. Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside Jack's cab, a fragile bubble of warmth fought back against the night, and for one man against death itself. The storm showed no mercy. It battered the truck like a living thing, rattling the windows and howling through every crack it could find. Snow piled up against the doors, sealing them into a fragile pocket of warmth, floating in a sea of ice. Inside the cab, Jack Turner worked in silence. He checked the stranger's pulse, weak but steady. He rubbed the man's arms and legs through the blankets, trying to coax warmth back into frozen limbs. Every now and then, the man stirred, mumbling incoherently. But Jack didn't push for answers. He knew enough to understand that sometimes the best help you could offer wasn't words, it was presence. He adjusted the heater vents to blow directly over the stranger, poured a second cup of coffee, and settled back into the driver's seat. Outside, the headlights threw weak halos into the blizzard. Ghostly cones swallowed just a few feet from the truck. Jack glanced at the CB radio, still crackling quietly on the dashboard. Most of the chatter had died down. Some truckers had simply gone silent. Others spoke in low tones about blocked roads, jackknifed rigs waiting for rescue crews that might not reach them until morning. Jack could hear the fear under their words. He didn't blame them. Storms like this didn't just test engines and tires. They tested men. The stranger coughed weakly, the sound dry and rasping. Jack twisted in his seat, grabbing a bottle of water from his supply crate and helping him take a few sips. "There you go," he said quietly. "Easy does it." The man blinked at him, his gaze glassy but grateful. Still, he said nothing. Jack didn't press. He just sat there, keeping the engine idling, the heater running the shelter intact hour after hour. He stared out into the endless white, the snow plastering itself against the windshield like sheets of cotton. He thought about the roads he'd traveled, the convoys he'd driven, the soldiers he'd hauled across deserts and jungles. Always moving something important. Tonight it wasn't freight he was delivering, it was life itself. At some point, maybe around 3 or 4 a.m., Jack dozed off for a few minutes at a time, the exhaustion creeping in despite his best efforts. But each cough from the stranger snapped him back awake, checking, adjusting, ensuring the warmth never faltered. The storm raged on without pity. Yet inside that battered old cab, 2 men, one nearly broken by the cold, the other quietly defying it, endured by the faint light of dawn when the first gray hints of morning seeped through the snow-smeared windows. Jack knew something had shifted. The stranger's breathing had evened out. Color, faint but real, had begun to creep back into his face. He was going to make it. Jack leaned back against the worn leather of his seat, a weary smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Out there in the storm, survival belonged to the strongest, but sometimes strength wasn't in the loudest shout or the fastest move. Sometimes it was in the silent, stubborn refusal to let another man die alone. And that night, a night carved deep into the memory of 2 lives, Jack Turner had chosen to stand against the storm simply because it was the right thing to do. Morning crept in slowly, as if even the sun was reluctant to rise after such a brutal night. The blizzard had finally begun to lose its fury. The howling winds settled into a low, mournful whisper, and the dense wall of snow thinned into a steady, gentle fall. Beyond the frosted windows, the world was transformed, a vast white silence, stretching as far as the eye could see. Jack Turner stirred in his seat, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. His breath still clouded the air inside the cab, but the heater had fought valiantly through the night, keeping the worst of the cold at bay. Beside him, the stranger shifted under the layers of blankets. Jack leaned forward. "Hey there," he said quietly. "You with me?" The man's eyes fluttered open, clearer now, more focused. He looked around the cab, confusion giving way to memory. "You're safe," Jack reassured him, offering another cup of lukewarm coffee. "Storm's letting up. Roads should start opening soon." The man accepted the cup with trembling hands, nodding weakly. For a moment they sat in silence, two survivors sharing a fragile peace in the aftermath of chaos. Then slowly the stranger reached into his inner coat pocket movements, still stiff from the cold, and pulled out a small metal identification card. He held it out to Jack without a word. Jack took it, wiping the frost off its surface with his sleeve. The words engraved there hit him like a jolt. Admiral Charles Whitaker, United States Navy. Jack blinked, stunned. An admiral, he sat up straighter. Instinctively, old habits from his Marine days kicking in, but he quickly caught himself. This wasn't a military base. This was a battered truck on the side of a snowy highway. Still, the weight of the man's identity settled over him. Jack looked back at the admiral, who watched him with calm, knowing eyes. There was no trace of arrogance, no expectation of special treatment. Just quiet gratitude. Jack handed the card back respectfully. "Name's Jack Turner," he said. "Just a trucker who couldn't leave a man to freeze." The admiral gave a faint, tired smile. "And I'm just a sailor who should have known better than to trust a rental car's GPS in a snowstorm." Jack chuckled, the tension easing between them. As they sipped coffee in the dim light, the CB radio crackled to life. With news, plows were clearing the main roads. Convoys would be escorted out of the worst hit zones within the hour. Jack nodded to himself. Time to move. He started the engine, the truck rumbling back to life with a reassuring growl. "I'll get you to the nearest police station," Jack said, throwing the rig into gear. "They'll help you arrange the rest." The admiral simply nodded, his gaze steady. No orders, no demands, just the quiet understanding between two men who knew what it meant to endure. As the truck rolled forward through the newly carved paths in the snow, Jack caught a glimpse of the rearview mirror, the endless white already beginning to fade into the past. They had survived the storm, but Jack had a feeling this night and the man he had pulled from the edge of death would follow him for a long, long time. The drive to the nearest town passed mostly in silence. Jack kept his focus on the slick, freshly plowed road, while Admiral Whitaker sat quietly in the passenger seat, nursing the last of the coffee. Outside, the world glistened under a thick blanket of snow, untouched, serene, as if the fury of the night before had been nothing but a bad dream. When they reached the small-town police station, Jack helped the Admiral inside. The officers, at first startled to see a man of his stature stumble through their doors, quickly jumped into action, radioing for transportation, offering hot drinks, fetching extra blankets. Whitaker turned to Jack, extending his hand firmly. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice carried the weight of a man who had given and received many orders, but in this moment it was just one human being speaking to another. Jack shook his hand without ceremony. Anyone would have done the same, he said, though deep down he knew that wasn't entirely true. Without waiting for any more fuss, Jack tipped his cap and headed back to his truck. There was freight still waiting to be delivered, and Jack Turner wasn't the type to leave a job unfinished. By evening, his load had been dropped at a small warehouse in Maple Creek. The paperwork signed, he hosed the road salt off the undercarriage of his rig and headed home to his quiet street in New Hampshire. He parked the truck out front, locked it up, and limped up the porch steps of his weathered gray house home, just as he had left it. The storm had passed, life, it seemed, had returned to normal. Jack didn't tell his neighbors about the Admiral. He didn't post about it online. He didn't call old Marine buddies to brag. In Jack's mind, he had simply done what needed to be done, no more, no less. He spent the next few days slipping back into his old rhythm, fixing a leaky pipe in the kitchen, replacing a blown bulb on the back porch. patching the frayed sleeve of his winter jacket. To him, the encounter was already folding itself neatly into memory. Just another page in a long, unremarkable life built on quiet actions no one saw. But what Jack didn't know was that elsewhere behind secure doors and polished desks, a different kind of conversation had begun. A conversation that would ripple outward far beyond anything Jack Turner could have expected. The storm he thought he had outrun was only just beginning. It started with the low hum of engines rolling through the neighborhood, an unusual sound for a sleepy New Hampshire morning. Jack Turner was on his front porch mending a loose railing when he first heard it. At first, he thought it was the garbage trucks maybe running late after the storm. But as he wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced up, he froze. 6 Navy Jeeps, spotless and gleaming, turned methodically onto his narrow street. Neighbors peered through curtains. Mrs. Donnelly across the road stepped out onto her porch coffee mug, forgotten in her hand. Children pressed their faces against frosty windows. The convoy rolled to a stop in front of Jack's modest gray house. Doors opened in unison. Uniformed personnel, crisp and sharp, despite the lingering winter chill, stepped onto the snowy curb. At the head of the group was a young officer in full dress, blues, a clipboard tucked neatly under his arm. He approached Jack's gate, snapping into a perfect salute. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "We've been dispatched on direct orders from Admiral Charles Whitaker." Jack, still gripping his hammer, blinked. "This must be a mistake," he muttered, but the officer continued unshaken. "Admiral Whitaker requested that we carry out critical repairs to your property, specifically the heating system, roofing, and structural integrity effective immediately." Before Jack could find the words to protest, the rest of the team was already unloading equipment. Ladders thudded into the snow. Toolboxes clanged open. Engineers moved with precise efficiency. Neighbors began to gather, curiosity overpowering their Midwestern reserve. Jack shuffled down the porch steps, waving a hand. "Hold on now. I don't need all this," he said, voice rough. The officer smiled slightly. "Sir, with all due respect," Admiral Whitaker was quite clear. His exact words were, "This man saved my life when no one else would. The Navy takes care of its own, and anyone who helps one of ours becomes one of ours." Jack opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. What could he say? Men in uniform moved like a well-oiled machine around him, assessing his battered roof, peering into the vents of his aging furnace, measuring sagging support beams. For the first time in years, Jack wasn't the one doing the fixing. He stood there, hammer still in hand, feeling completely and utterly seen. The storm had passed, but the ripples he had created were only just beginning to reach the shore. At first, they watched from a distance. Jack could feel their eyes. Neighbors who had once nodded politely but never lingered now stood on their porches, craning their necks, whispering among themselves. The small-town rumor mill spun fast, and soon everyone on the block knew something extraordinary was happening at Jack Turner's place. By the second day, curiosity overcame hesitation. Mrs. Donnelly, who had never exchanged more than a few words with Jack in a decade, approached with a plate of steaming cinnamon rolls. "Thought you might need a little something to keep you warm," she said, smiling awkwardly. Jack, caught off guard, accepted the plate with a quiet, "Thank you," unsure what else to say. Later that afternoon, Mr. Patel from 2 houses down wandered over, hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. "Didn't know we had a real hero living among us," he said gruffly, nodding toward the Navy team bustling around Jack's porch. Jack chuckled under his breath. "I'm no hero," he replied. "Just did what anyone should do." But the truth was, Jack had never felt particularly seen by his community before. He had been content in his solitude, or so he thought. Now something was shifting. Kids from the neighborhood rode their bikes slower past his house, sneaking peeks at the construction crews and whispering in wonder. A few brave ones even waved at Jack, their faces lighting up when he waved back. One little boy, no more than 8 years old, skidded to a stop on his scooter and looked up at him wide-eyed. "Sir, are you like a secret agent or something?" Jack laughed for the first time in what felt like years. "Not quite," he said, ruffling the boy's hat. "Just an old truck driver who lent a hand." The boy beamed as if Jack had just confirmed he was Superman. Word spread beyond the neighborhood, too. At the grocery store, clerks who usually just rang up his coffee and supplies now greeted him by name. The cashier at the hardware store slipped a thank you note into his bag, handwritten on a scrap of receipt paper. Even the local VFW, the chapter Jack had always been too shy to join, called to invite him personally to their next meeting. "We'd be honored to have you," the commander said simply over the phone. Jack stared at the receiver for a long moment after hanging up. Something deep inside him, something he hadn't even realized had grown heavy, felt lighter now. He had spent so many years believing that his quiet life meant he had slipped through the cracks, forgotten. But now, slowly, steadily, the community he thought had never noticed him was opening its arms. And Jack Turner, for the first time in a long time, found himself stepping forward to meet them. 3 days after the Navy teams finished their work, Jack Turner found a small envelope tucked under his front door. No postage, no fanfare, just a plain, hand-delivered envelope marked only with his name. Inside was a simple invitation. "You are respectfully requested to attend the VFW Hall this Friday at 6 p.m. No explanation, no hints. Jack almost tossed it aside. Formal gatherings weren't his thing. He wasn't a man for speeches, and he certainly didn't see himself as someone worth celebrating. But something about the careful handwriting, about the respect in the phrasing, tugged at him. And so Friday evening, Jack found himself stepping into the warm wood-paneled hall where veterans gathered under flags that had seen both peace and war. The room quieted as he entered. Old soldiers, young servicemen, their families, they all turned toward him with expressions that made Jack's chest tighten. At the front of the room stood Admiral Charles Whitaker, still bearing the upright posture of a man who had spent a lifetime commanding oceans, but whose smile now was purely personal. Whitaker stepped forward, a small wooden plaque cradled carefully in his hands. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't draped in ribbons or shining medals. It was simple, solid, and carved with the words, "Veterans Shelter, honored by honor itself." The Admiral's voice was steady as he spoke. "Jack Turner reminded us that the measure of a man isn't the medals he wears, but the moments he chooses to act when no one is watching." He handed the plaque to Jack with both hands, a gesture of deep respect. Jack accepted it awkwardly, clearing his throat against the wave of emotion threatening to rise. There were no speeches from him, no dramatic stories, just a quiet nod, a handshake, a few muttered words. Just did what needed doing. The room didn't erupt in applause. Instead, it rose, every man, woman, and child standing tall heads, bowed in silent acknowledgement. It wasn't fame Jack received that night. It wasn't glory. It was something far rarer. It was belonging. The kind you earn not through words, but through the simple, stubborn decency of stepping into a storm and bringing someone else back alive. In a world that often moves too fast, where headlines chase noise and drama, it's easy to forget that true heroism rarely makes a sound. Jack Turner didn't rescue an admiral because he wanted recognition. He did it because somewhere deep inside he knew that decency, real, stubborn, everyday decency, is what holds our communities, our country, and our humanity together. Today, the storms we face might not always be blizzards. Sometimes they're moments of choice, moments to step forward when it would be easier to stay in the warmth of our own lives. How many people would stop today for a stranger in need? How often do we choose to act simply because it's right, not because it's rewarded? Maybe that's the lesson Jack left behind. That ordinary courage done quietly and without expectation still matters more than we know. Now, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever witnessed or experienced an act of kindness that changed everything? Do you believe small, unseen choices still shape the world around us? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences could inspire someone else to step into their own storm. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next journey into the heart of real, unforgettable stories. See you in the next one.